6 minutes, she whispered. Maybe less. Sloane's hands shook over the timer, red numbers counting down. 180 men, gathering 200 yards away, laughing, hugging their families, completely unaware. Sloane, don't you dare. Kestrel's voice cracked through her earpiece. She cut it off. Because there wasn't time for goodbyes. Because 18 years ago, her mother had vanished, protecting her from a truth this same man had buried. Because now, kneeling beside a crate of military explosives, with a colonel's voice still echoing in her ears, evidence is only as useful as the people left alive to testify. Sloane understood exactly what she had to do. She hauled the first crate onto the cart. 4 minutes. She thought of her mother's hands guiding hers on a Montana hillside 20 years ago. 4 words, a lifetime of preparation for this exact moment. Breathe out, then wait. Except waiting was over. She ran toward the only cover she had, and toward whatever came next. The fog came off the Gulf that morning, the way it always did in June, thick and low and unwilling to leave, rolling across the marsh grass in slow gray sheets, until the whole training field looked like something out of a memory, rather than a place a person could actually stand. Sloane Whitmore knelt in the wet grass at Camp Alderwood, with a rifle steadied against her shoulder and her breath held like a secret she wasn't ready to give away. 400 yards out, a steel silhouette shaped like a human torso, swinging faint in a crosswind that smelled of salt and diesel, and the particular mineral tang of low tide. Behind her, 180 men in digital camouflage stood in loose formation on the observation line, waiting to see whether the woman kneeling in front of them could actually do what her file claimed she could do. She could. The wind pushed against her from the left, 6 miles an hour, maybe 7, gusting higher in short bursts that most shooters would have fought against instead of reading. Sloane didn't fight it. She let it become part of the equation instead of an obstacle to it, the way her mother had taught her a lifetime ago on a Montana hillside where the wind never once behaved the way a textbook said it should. Breathe out, then wait. The shot cracked across the field. A single flat report that rolled out over the marsh and came back changed, softer, swallowed by distance. The target rang. One clean note, metal on metal, and then the kind of silence that only exists in the half-second after something impossible has just happened in front of witnesses who weren't sure they believed it until it was already done. Nobody clapped. Nobody was supposed to. This was a training exercise, not a performance, and the men behind her had been raised inside a culture that distrusted applause the way it distrusted most things that felt too easy. But she felt the shift anyway, felt it in the way the fog seemed to hold still around her, felt it in the particular quality of silence that comes when 200 people stop looking at a woman as though she doesn't belong somewhere and start looking at her like she might be the reason the room makes sense. Sloane rose from the grass, brushed the dew from her knees with the flat of her palm, did not smile, because smiling had never once been the point of any of this, not when she was 8 years old on a porch, with a rifle too big for her hands, and not now, 26 years old, and kneeling on a government training field, with a scope still warm against her cheek. Again, said a voice behind her left shoulder. She didn't turn around. She already knew the voice, knew the particular gravel in it, the way it had been worn down over decades by salt air and command presence, and 1,000 mornings exactly like this one. You said one shot would be enough to make your point, Senior Chief. I lied. She almost smiled then. Almost. The corner of her mouth twitched toward it, and then thought better of the idea entirely, because that was Dale Kestrel in a single sentence. And Sloane had learned, in her first 3 weeks at Camp Alderwood, that Dale Kestrel rarely wasted a sentence on anything that didn't need saying. 61 years old. A neck like a fire hydrant wrapped in sun-weathered skin, a voice that could strip paint off a hull at 40 paces, and still somehow manage warmth underneath the gravel if a person knew to listen for it. 28 years in the Navy before he'd traded a uniform for a whistle and a clipboard and a stretch of coastline the government called Camp Alderwood on paper, and everyone who'd ever served there called nowhere in every conversation that mattered. He'd doubted her for the first 3 weeks. Not hated. That wasn't fair, and Sloane had learned to be careful with words like hate, because words like that got thrown around too easily by people who'd never actually had to survive the real thing. He'd doubted her the way a man doubts anything unfamiliar standing in a space he spent decades believing belonged to someone else. Now he stood a few paces behind her, with field glasses raised, studying the target through the fog, studying her through something that had started, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, to look a great deal like respect. Again, he said. She reloaded without answering, knelt without hurrying, breathed the way her body had been trained to breathe since before it had any say in the matter. And somewhere in the part of her mind that never fully stopped working, no matter how hard she tried to make it rest, a memory surfaced, uninvited, the way they always were, these memories, arriving without permission and leaving the same way, on their own schedule, indifferent to whether she was ready. A porch, a rifle too heavy for her small hands, a woman's voice, low and even and endlessly patient, saying the same 4 words she said every single time, in every single lesson, until the words stopped being instruction and became something closer to a heartbeat. Breathe out, then wait. Sloane blinked the memory back into whatever drawer it lived in, settled her cheek against the stock, fired. The target rang again. The observation line broke apart slowly. After the second shot, men drifting back toward the staging area, in 2s and 3s, low conversation rising up out of the fog, the way it always did after something worth talking about had just happened in front of them. Sloane packed her rifle into its case, with movements so practiced they required no thought at all, which was, she had come to understand, exactly the problem with muscle memory. It left the mind free to wander into places it had no business going. She thought about her mother's hands, steady, always steady, even on the mornings when nothing else about their life had been steady at all. She thought about the particular way sunlight used to fall across the Montana hillside where she'd learned to shoot before she'd learned long division, and how strange it was that a person could remember the exact quality of light from 18 years ago and still struggle, some days, to remember the sound of the voice that had stood beside her in it. "You've got a look on your face," Kestrel said, falling into step beside her as they crossed the field toward the equipment sheds. The kind of look that usually means a person somewhere else entirely, just thinking. "About the shot? About my mother?" Kestrel didn't answer right away. He rarely did when a subject like that surfaced. Sloane had noticed that about him early, the way certain topics made even a man built like a fire hydrant go quiet and careful. The way a person walks differently on ice than on solid ground. "She taught you," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "She taught me everything I know before I was old enough to know what any of it meant," Sloane said. "Wind reading, breath control, how to be still enough that the world forgets you're there at all. I used to think it was a game. I didn't understand until much later that she was preparing me for something." "For what?" Sloane looked out across the fog, toward the tree line, where the range faded into pine forest, and the pine forest faded into everything she didn't yet know about her own history. "I don't know," she said. "I've spent 18 years trying to figure that out." The trailer that served as Camp Alderwood's medical training office smelled like coffee and antiseptic and old carpet that had absorbed 11 years of Gulf Coast humidity and never quite forgiven anyone for it. Sloane sat behind a metal desk that wobbled if a person leaned on it wrong, reviewing casualty simulation reports from that morning's drill, red pen moving down a checklist of tourniquet applications and airway management scores. When the door opened without a knock, Petty Officer Casey Doyle stood in the frame like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to be there. 24 years old, freckled across a nose that hadn't yet been sunburned enough times to stop freckling. The kind of earnest, unguarded face that hadn't been rearranged yet by disappointment, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was closer to that particular education than he probably realized. He had a folder in his hands, and he was holding it the way a person holds something that might, if handled wrong, explode. "Ma'am, you got a second?" "I have several," Sloane said, setting down the red pen. "Sit." He sat. He didn't open the folder. He just held it against his chest like a shield. "That shot this morning," he said. "The 400-yard one. What about it? I've never seen anyone do that live. Not on a range with wind coming off the water like that. Not without a spotter calling corrections." Because that was true. Because most snipers spent years training to make a shot like that under ideal conditions. let alone crosswind conditions coming off open water, let alone at 06600, with fog still clinging low enough to distort the light itself. I had a good teacher, Sloane said. Who? She didn't answer right away. Which was the problem? Which had always been the problem. Whenever a question wandered anywhere near the door in her chest, that she kept locked, bolted, and furnished with nothing at all. Someone who isn't around anymore, she finally said. Casey nodded slowly, the way a person nods at an answer that satisfies the surface of a question without touching what's underneath it. He was smarter than his freckles suggested, Sloane was beginning to realize. Smart enough to know when to let a silence sit instead of poking at it. There's a rumor going around, he said instead. There's always a rumor going around a base, like this one. This one's about you. Sloane set down her pen entirely. Go on. They're saying your file's got a flag on it. Not a bad flag. A strange one. Like there's something in your background that doesn't match up with a civilian contractor billet. Something cold moved through Sloane's chest. Fast. Gone before she could properly name it. The way certain kinds of fear move too quick for the mind to catch and hold and examine. Where'd you hear that? Around. Casey. I can't say, ma'am, I gave my word. She studied him for a long moment. He held her gaze, which she respected, because most people his age looked away first when a superior officer stared them down like that. All right, she said finally. Thank you for telling me. He stood to leave. Stopped at the door, one hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said. Whoever taught you to shoot like that, I hope you find a way to thank them someday. He left before she could answer. Which was, she thought, watching the door swing shut behind him, probably for the best, because she didn't have one. Not one she could give out loud, anyway. The rest of her shift passed the way most shifts did at Camp Alderwood, structured chaos disguised as routine. She oversaw 2 more casualty simulations, corrected a young corpsman's tourniquet placement with more patience than she felt, and spent 45 minutes updating a training manual that hadn't been revised since a war that had already ended, before half these trainees were born. At noon, she ate alone in the corner of the mess hall, the way she usually did, not because she disliked company, but because solitude had become a habit, somewhere along the way. A habit built out of 18 years of learning not to let anyone get close enough to ask the questions she didn't have answers for. Except today, the solitude didn't sit right. Today it itched. Because Casey's warning had lodged somewhere behind her ribs and refused to dislodge, no matter how many casualty reports she buried it under. A flag on her file. Something that didn't match a civilian contractor billet. The words rearranged themselves in her mind over and over, until by the time her shift ended at 1700, she'd convinced herself of at least 4 different explanations, none of which she believed, and abandoned all 4 before she'd even reached her truck in the gravel lot. She drove the 11 miles home along a road that ran flat and dark through pine forest, past a gas station that closed at 9 and a diner that never closed at all, toward a small clapboard house with a porch light that Ruth Calder had left burning every single night for 18 years. Sloane's grandmother sat in the same rocking chair she'd occupied for as long as Sloane could remember, a shawl draped over her shoulders, even in the thick June heat, because Ruth got cold in ways that had nothing whatsoever to do with the weather and everything to do with the house that had been missing someone for 18 years. You're late, Ruth said. Not an accusation, just an observation, delivered in the particular tone that old women reserve for truths that carry the weight of love, without needing to announce themselves as such. Training ran long. It always does. Sloane climbed the porch steps and sat on the top one, exactly as she had since she was 8 years old. And this porch had been the only solid thing left standing in a world that had come apart underneath her feet without warning. The evening light was doing something soft and golden through the pines, the kind of light that made a person forgive the humidity for a few minutes at a time, and somewhere off in the tree line, a whippoorwill was starting its evening call, over and over, patient and unhurried. Someone asked about my file today, Sloane said, watching the light change. Ruth's rocking chair went still. What kind of someone? A trainee. Says there's a flag on my background check. Something that doesn't fit a civilian contractor. The chair started moving again. Slower now, the wood creaking in a rhythm that had accompanied half of Sloane's childhood conversations on this exact porch. "You never told me exactly what happened to my mother," Sloane said. "Not really. You told me she died in a training accident. You told me it was ruled her fault. You told me not to ask more than that, and for 18 years I didn't, because I was afraid of what asking might cost you. Because there wasn't more than that to tell, Grandma." Sloane. They sat there, together. Two women 2 generations apart, both carrying the same silence like a stone they'd agreed, somewhere along the way, without ever discussing it directly, never to set down in front of each other. "I was 8, Sloane said. "I remember her hands guiding mine, teaching me to hold a rifle steady before I could ride a bike without training wheels. I remember she used to say the same 4 words every single time, like a piece of a song I never learned the rest of. Breathe out, then wait. I still hear her saying it, Grandma, every time I take a shot, 18 years, and I still hear her voice like she's standing right behind me." Ruth's hand found Sloane's on the porch step. Old skin over young skin, both of them shaking slightly. Just enough to notice, just enough to mean something. "Your mother," Ruth said slowly, "was the finest shot I ever saw in my entire life, man or woman. I watched her hit targets nobody else on that base could hit, and I watched grown men who'd spent decades in uniform stand there afterward, not knowing what to say to her, because what she could do didn't fit into any box they'd built for a woman standing on their range." "What happened to her?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment. The whippoorwill called again, closer now, and somewhere down the road, a truck passed with its radio turned up too loud, the sound rising and fading and gone. "I buried her memory instead of her body," Ruth finally said, "because that's all the Navy ever gave me to bury. A folded flag, a closed casket order I never questioned, because questioning it felt, at the time, like it might kill me too. What if it wasn't her fault?" Ruth turned to look at her granddaughter, fully now. Something moved behind the old woman's eyes, something that had clearly been waiting a very long time to finally be asked the question out loud. "What makes you say that?" "Because I've spent 18 years being told my mother was careless, that she made a mistake that got her killed on a training range with no witnesses and no explanation anyone would ever give me. Not even you, not even after all this time. And I don't believe it anymore, Grandma. I don't think I ever really believed it. I just didn't know what to do with the anger, so I turned it into obedience instead, into rules, into being the best in every single room I walked into, so nobody could ever say I got there because of who my mother happened to be." The porch light buzzed overhead, a soft electric hum that had become, over 18 years, as familiar to Sloane as her own heartbeat. A moth threw itself against the glass, over and over, the way moths do when they've mistaken something dangerous for something that might finally save them. "There are things I never told you," Ruth said quietly, "because I didn't think you were ready to carry them. Because I told myself, every single year that passed, that there would be a better time to say it. And every year, that better time never came, and eventually 18 years had gone by, and the silence had grown so large, I didn't know how to speak through it anymore. I'm 26 years old, Sloane said, her voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. I train men to save lives on a battlefield. I think I can carry a few things, Grandma. I think I've earned that much." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting somewhere past the tree line, somewhere Sloane couldn't follow. "Your mother didn't die on a training range," Ruth said finally. "Not the way they told us. Not the way I let myself believe. Because believing anything else felt unbearable at the time." The world went very still around Sloane. The crickets, the moth against the glass, even the wind through the pines seemed to hold its breath along with her, waiting to see what would come next. "Then how?" "I don't know," Ruth said. "That's the truth, Sloane. I never knew. I only know what the folder said, and I only know that the folder never added up. Not then. Not now, all these years later, when I take it out from under my bed every so often and read it again, hoping the words will somehow rearrange themselves into something that finally makes sense." "What folder?" Ruth's hands tightened around Sloane's, old fingers wrapping around young ones with a strength that surprised them both. "The one I've kept locked in a box under my bed for 18 years, she said, "because I was afraid of what would happen if I ever let anyone read it. Afraid of what it might mean if the wrong person ever learned it still existed. The box was small, metal, the kind of gray military surplus plus container that had probably held ammunition once, before it came to hold something far heavier. Sloane sat cross-legged on her grandmother's bedroom floor at 11 o'clock that night, with the box open in front of her, the overhead light casting long shadows across walls that hadn't changed since Sloane was a child sleeping down the hall, her hands hovering over the contents as though they might catch fire if she moved too quickly. A photograph. First, Corinne Whitmore, 28 years old in the image, kneeling behind a rifle on a range that could have been anywhere in the country, laughing at something outside the frame that the photograph had no way of preserving. Sloane had never seen her mother laugh like that. In every memory Sloane possessed, Corinne's face had been serious, focused, a woman who understood, out in the field, that softness could get a person killed if it showed up at the wrong moment. But here, captured in a photograph nearly 3 decades old, Corinne was young and unguarded and radiantly alive in a way that made Sloane's chest ache with a grief she hadn't fully known how to access until this exact moment. Under the photograph sat a manila folder, its edges gone soft with age, its corners bent from being handled and re-handled by a woman who couldn't bring herself to either read it in full or throw it away entirely. Sloane opened it slowly. Official Navy letterhead, a summary of findings, typed in the flat bureaucratic language that institutions use to compress a human being's entire existence into a single page. A case number, and then halfway down the first page, a line that made Sloane stop breathing entirely. Cause of incident, undetermined pending further review. Not accident, not negligence. Undetermined pending further review. She flipped to the next page. A different document, different letterhead. This one stamped with a classification marking that had been crudely blacked out with what looked like an ordinary office marker, not the careful, systematic redaction of a government agency following proper procedure, but the rushed, imperfect concealment of a person working alone, in a hurry, afraid of being caught. Someone had tried to hide something, and whoever it was, they hadn't been particularly good at it. "Grandma," Sloane said, her voice thin and unsteady, "why does this say undetermined? You told me it was ruled her fault. You told me that for 18 years. Ruth stood in the doorway, one hand pressed flat against the frame like she needed it to keep herself upright. "Because that's what the man who came to my door told me," she said. "A Navy officer. Very polished. Very sorry for my loss." Or so he said, with a practiced sympathy that I mistook, at the time, for genuine feeling. He told me the investigation had been closed, that it was a training accident, that your mother had made an error in judgment that cost her life, and that out of respect for her service, the specifics would remain confidential in order to protect her reputation. And you believed him. "I had a 6-year-old granddaughter asleep down the hall," Ruth said, "and a folded flag in my arms, and no earthly idea what else I was supposed to do with either of those things. I was drowning, Sloane. A drowning person doesn't argue with the hand that's holding out a rope, even if some part of her suspects the rope might be tied to something rotten." Sloane's hands were trembling now, badly enough that the pages in her grip fluttered. She turned another sheet. A list of names, most of them redacted with the same crude marker, one of them left visible, either through oversight or something else entirely. Colonel G. Ashworth, overseeing officer. The name meant nothing to her, not yet, but something in her gut turned over anyway. The particular sensation of a body recognizing danger before the mind has found the vocabulary to name it. "Who is this?" she asked, holding up the page toward the lamplight. Ruth crossed the room slowly and looked down at the name. Her face changed, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, the expression of a person who has had an old wound pressed without warning, hard enough to remember exactly why it never fully healed. "I don't know," Ruth said. "I never met him, but I remember the name, because your mother mentioned it once, weeks before she disappeared, on the phone, and she sounded strange when she said it. Careful, like she was choosing every single word with more caution than she usually bothered with." "What did she say?" "She said, and I remember this exactly, because I have replayed it in my head more times than I could ever count in the years since. She said, 'Mom, if anything ever happens to me, don't trust anyone who tells you it was my fault. The room seemed to shrink around Sloane, the walls pressing closer, the single lamp in the corner, throwing shadows that stretched and pooled in the corners like something alive. For a moment she felt 8 years old again, sitting on a porch step in the dark, waiting for headlights that were never, ever coming home. She knew, Sloane whispered. She knew something was going to happen to her, and she still went. She still did whatever it was she was doing. Yes, Ruth said quietly. I believe she did. Sleep did not come that night, or the next. Sloane lay awake in her own small house, a mile down the road from her grandmother's, staring at a ceiling fan turning lazy circles in the dark, running the same 4 words through her mind on a loop that refused, no matter how tired she became, to finally break. Breathe out, then wait. Except waiting had never gotten her anywhere. Waiting was what she had done for 18 years, patient and obedient and quietly furious underneath all of it, and all that waiting had earned her was a folded flag, a closed casket, and a hole in the middle of her life, shaped exactly like a mother she'd barely had the chance to know. She thought about the classification marking. Someone had tried to black out with an ordinary marker, in a hurry, imperfectly. Thought about the phrase undetermined pending further review, a phrase that implied a review had either never actually happened or had happened, and been buried somewhere with no bottom to it at all. Thought about the name, Colonel G. Ashworth, overseeing officer, because a name like that didn't belong attached to a routine training accident report. A name like that belonged to something bigger, something someone had wanted to make disappear as thoroughly and permanently as they'd made Corinne Whitmore disappear. At 4 a.m, Sloane finally gave up on sleep entirely. She rose in the dark, dressed without turning on a light, and drove to Camp Alderwood 2 hours before her shift began, because there was exactly one person on that base who might actually be able to tell her something true. Dale Kestrel was already at the range when she arrived, the way he always seemed to be, no matter how early Sloane thought she was getting there first. Some men made their peace with the slower rhythms of a life after service by fishing, or golfing, or sitting quietly on porches counting the days. Kestrel had made his peace by never fully leaving the only life that had ever made sense to him, standing on a range at 4 a.m, with a clipboard he didn't need, and a routine he'd probably kept for 11 straight years without missing a single day. He looked up when her headlights swept across the gravel lot. Didn't seem surprised to see her, which somehow made everything that followed feel less like an intrusion, and more like something he'd been expecting. Couldn't sleep, she said, walking toward him across grass still wet with dew. Nobody sleeps out here, Kestrel said. That's why God invented coffee and bad decisions in roughly equal measure. She almost laughed, almost, but the weight sitting in her chest wouldn't let the laugh escape all the way. Dale, can I ask you something? Something in her voice must have shifted, because he set down the clipboard he'd been holding and gave her his full, undivided attention, the particular quality of focus he only offered for things that actually mattered. Go ahead. Have you ever heard the name Ashworth? Colonel G. Ashworth. Kestrel's face did something complicated in the gray pre-dawn light. Recognition, first, fast and involuntary. Then caution, hard behind it, like a door closing before anyone could see what was standing on the other side. Where'd you hear that name? He said. Does it matter? It matters a great deal, Sloane. More than you probably understand yet. She hesitated, but she had come too far now, in the space of a single sleepless night, to stop moving forward. My mother's file, she said. The one about her death. His name is on it. Overseeing officer. Kestrel's jaw went tight. He looked away from her, out across the range, toward the 400-yard mark where she'd made that impossible shot only 2 mornings earlier, as though the answer to whatever question was turning behind his eyes might be waiting somewhere out there in the fog. Who was your mother? He asked quietly, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer and was only asking to buy himself a few extra seconds before hearing it confirmed out loud. Corinne Whitmore. The name landed on him like a physical weight. His shoulders dropped, just slightly. His eyes closed for a second, maybe 2, and when they opened again there was something in them Sloane had never once seen from Dale Kestrel in the 3 weeks she'd known him. Grief. Plain and unguarded and entirely unlike the man she'd come to know. You knew her, Sloane said. It wasn't a question. I served with her, he said. 18 years ago, Before you were even old enough to remember much of anything about the world beyond that porch of yours." He paused, and something in his weathered face softened around the edges. "She was the best shot I ever trained beside in nearly 3 decades of service. Better than me. Better than nearly every man who ever went through this program, before or since." "Then why?" Sloane's voice cracked entirely now. "Why does everyone act like her name is something to be afraid of? Why did it take a metal box under my grandmother's bed for me to even hear the truth about what happened to her?" Kestrel turned to look at her fully, and for the first time since she'd met him, 3 weeks of doubt and testing and grudging, hard-won respect fell away entirely, replaced by something that looked unmistakably like fear. "Because the day she died," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "wasn't a training accident, Sloane. Whatever else it wasn't that. And Grant Ashworth was the man who signed off on the report that said it was." They sat in Kestrel's truck as the sun finally cleared the tree line, because some conversations weren't meant to happen standing out in the open, where anyone crossing the gravel lot might walk close enough to overhear. "I was there," Kestrel said, both hands wrapped around a coffee thermos he never once drank from. "The week before it happened. We were both assigned to a joint logistics exercise, testing new inventory protocols across 3 training facilities along the coast. Your mother found something in the numbers that didn't add up. Ammunition counts, weapons serial numbers, small discrepancies at first. The kind of thing you'd expect from ordinary paperwork errors, a clerk transposing digits. Nothing that would raise an eyebrow on its own. But it wasn't paperwork errors. No," Kestrel said. The more she pulled at the thread, the bigger it got underneath her hands. "She came to me 2 teats before it happened and told me she believed equipment was being diverted. Skimmed off shipments before they ever reached formal inventory. Small amounts, spread thin across multiple bases. Small enough that nobody would notice unless they were looking as hard as she was already looking." Sloane's hands had gone cold in her lap. Cold enough that she pressed them together, seeking warmth that wasn't coming. "Did she tell anyone else? Anyone in her chain of command?" "She told her chain of command," Kestrel said, "which included Ashworth. 2 days later she was dead, officially a weapons malfunction during a live-fire training exercise. Unofficially, nobody who actually knew her believed that story for 1 single second, because your mother didn't make careless mistakes. Not ever. Not once in all the years I served alongside her. Then why didn't anyone push back? Why didn't anyone demand a proper investigation?" Kestrel's laugh came out hollow, bitter around the edges in a way that told Sloane exactly how many times he'd asked himself that same question over the years, in the dark, alone, without ever landing on an answer he could live with. "Because the people who might have pushed back got reassigned within a month," he said. "Scattered across the country in every direction, myself included. I ended up here, running drills at a training facility nobody's ever heard of, for 11 straight years, and I told myself it was just how careers moved in this business. Random, unpredictable, the kind of thing that happens to everyone eventually. But it wasn't random." "No," Kestrel said. "It wasn't random at all, and I was a coward for not seeing it sooner. Or maybe I saw it clearly enough, and just didn't want to know what seeing it actually meant, because knowing would have required me to do something about it, and I wasn't the kind of man, back then, who did something about things that frightened me." Sloane stared out the windshield at the range, at the target 400 yards away, silver and unremarkable in the early morning light. "I've been standing on this base for 4 months," she said, "training the next generation of SEALs to save lives out on a battlefield. And this whole time, the man responsible for what happened to my mother might still be walking around somewhere in this same military, with nobody ever asking him a single question about any of it. Sloane." "What?" Kestrel hesitated, then reached into the glove compartment of his truck and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at every crease, the particular softness that comes from being carried and refolded 1,000 times over many years. "I kept something too," he said, "for 18 years. Never showed it to anyone. Told myself I was protecting my career, my pension, my own peace of mind. But the truth of it is, I was just scared. Scared enough to let it sit folded in a glove compartment instead of doing anything useful with it." He handed her the paper. It was a supply manifest, dated the week before Corinne's death, a list of equipment transfers between 3 training facilities along the coast, one of which, Sloane noted, with a chill that moved straight through her chest, was Camp Alderwood. At the bottom, a signature, faded but legible. Colonel Grant Ashworth. He's still active duty, Kestrel said quietly. Higher up now than he was back then. Which means whatever your mother uncovered 18 years ago either never got properly fixed, or it got buried so deep that it simply kept growing in the dark, unbothered, for 2 decades. By the time Sloane returned to the medical training trailer that morning, she had made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a debt finally coming due after 18 years of accrued interest. She was going to find out what happened to her mother, not for revenge. She told herself that clearly, deliberately, the way a person tells herself something she needs to believe before she can trust herself to act on it responsibly. Not for revenge, for the truth, for Ruth, who had carried a locked box under her bed for 18 years, waiting for a day she probably never believed would actually come. For every trainee who walked through Camp Alderwood without knowing that the man overseeing their careers might be the very same man who'd erased a woman's death and quietly called it an accident. And if she allowed herself full honesty in the privacy of her own mind, for the 8-year-old girl who used to sit on a porch step every single night, waiting for headlights that never, ever came home. Casey Doyle found her at lunch, sitting alone at the edge of the mess hall with a tray she hadn't touched, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, sitting across from her without waiting to be invited. "I haven't. That flag on your file," he said, lowering his voice. "I asked around a little more. Careful, like you'd want me to be. Turns out it's not really about you at all. Not directly." "What do you mean?" "It's tied to a name. Someone flagged your application because your last name matched a case file from years back. Someone in personnel security got curious and pulled a thread they probably weren't supposed to pull, at least not without proper clearance." Sloane's pulse quickened, fast and sharp. "What case file?" Casey glanced around the mess hall before lowering his voice further. Close enough, now that Sloane had to lean in to catch every word. "I only saw the case number. I didn't have clearance to see anything beyond that, but I wrote it down." He slid a folded napkin across the table, the paper soft from being pressed against his palm. "In case it means something to you." Sloane unfolded it under the table, where no one else could see. A case number, written in Casey's careful, blocky handwriting. And beside it, 3 words he must have overheard somewhere, spoken by someone who clearly hadn't realized anyone was still listening. Sable. Still open. That evening, Sloane drove to the diner on the edge of town, the same one that never closed, and sat in a corner booth with her mother's folder spread across the laminate table and her phone lit with a search she had been almost afraid to run. Task Force Sable. Nothing came up in any public record, which meant nothing at all, or which meant everything, depending entirely on how deeply something had been deliberately buried. She thought about her mother's laughing photograph, the one moment of unguarded joy in an entire box, otherwise filled with grief and bureaucracy. She thought about the 4 words that still echoed every single time she pulled a trigger. She thought about Ruth, alone on that porch tonight for the first time in 18 years, without a secret sitting heavy in her chest, and terrified, Sloane suspected, of what letting it out into the world might ultimately cost her granddaughter. She thought about Colonel Grant Ashworth, whoever he was now, wherever he was now, still active duty, still climbing whatever ladder he'd spent 2 decades climbing, while a case marked undetermined pending further review sat gathering dust in a locked metal box under a bed in a small house surrounded by pines. Outside the diner window, the parking lot lights buzzed against the gathering dark. A truck idled near the far end of the lot, its headlights off, its engine running low and steady. Sloane noticed it, the way her mind noticed things now, without her fully choosing to notice them. Because that was the thing about training a mind, the way her mother had trained her body. All those years ago, on a hillside in Montana, eventually a person started noticing things, small things, things that didn't quite add up. The way a wobbling table doesn't add up, the way a redacted line doesn't add up, the way a truck sitting still with its lights off doesn't add up. in a parking lot, otherwise empty at this hour. The truck sat there for 11 minutes, then pulled away without ever once parking. She told herself it was nothing. She did not entirely believe herself, and some quiet, newly awakened part of her mind understood, for the first time, that not believing herself might turn out to be the most useful instinct she had left. She barely slept that night either, and when she finally did drift off sometime after 2 in the morning, her dreams carried her back to Montana, back to a hillside she hadn't physically stood on in over 18 years, but that her body still remembered in perfect, aching detail. In the dream, her mother knelt beside her, behind a rifle, the way she had 100 times in Sloane's actual childhood, her hands guiding small fingers into position with the same infinite patience she'd shown every single time. "Breathe out," her mother said in the dream, her voice exactly the way Sloane remembered it, low and warm and utterly certain. "Then wait." "Wait for what?" Dream, Sloane asked. 8 years old again, small and unsure. "For the moment that matters," her mother said. "You'll know it when it comes. And when it does, everything I've taught you will already be there, waiting inside your hands, whether you feel ready or not." Sloane woke at 4:40, with her heart pounding and her cheeks wet, the dream already dissolving at the edges the way dreams do, leaving behind only the feeling of it, urgent and unfinished, like a sentence her mother had never gotten the chance to complete. She lay in the dark for a long moment, staring at the ceiling fan turning its slow circles, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that she was no longer simply grieving her mother. She was preparing, in some part of herself she hadn't fully acknowledged yet, to finish whatever her mother had started. She returned to Camp Alderwood the next morning, to find Kestrel waiting for her outside the training trailer, his face carved from something harder than anything she'd seen on him before, harder even than the grief from the previous morning. "We need to talk," he said, "somewhere private." They walked together to the far edge of the range, past the 400-yard mark, toward a tree line where the sound of morning drills faded slowly into birdsong, and the low, constant hush of wind moving through pine. "I made a call last night," Kestrel said. "To someone I trust, retired NCIS, name's Ray Holcomb. Worked closed cases along this coastline for 30 years before he finally hung it up. I told him what you found and..." "He remembers the name Sable," Kestrel said. "Vaguely, at first, from the edges of a case he worked years ago that got shut down before it ever went anywhere close to a courtroom. He said if it's the same task force, it was never officially a real unit. Never had a proper designation. Never appeared on any legitimate roster, which means somebody invented it deliberately, as cover, a name useful for moving equipment and paperwork, without any of it ever tracing back to a real person." Sloane's stomach tightened, so it wasn't a rogue supply sergeant skimming ammunition off the books for a little extra profit. "No," Kestrel said. "It sounds bigger than that. Organized, deliberate, in a way that takes real planning to build and real patience to maintain over time. And whoever built it made absolutely certain it would be nearly impossible to trace back to any single name, buried under layers of shell paperwork that would take a career investigator years to fully unravel. Except Ashworth signed a supply manifest with his own hand," Sloane said. "That's not nothing, Dale, that's a start." "No," Kestrel agreed slowly. "It's not nothing at all. It's a start." Sloane looked out across the range, past the tree line beyond it, at the whole quiet, deceptively ordinary morning unfolding, around a base that trained young men to walk directly into danger, without hesitation, run in part by a system that had let her mother's death vanish into a folder marked undetermined and simply never looked back. "Not once. In 18 years. I want to meet this Holcomb," she said. "He said the same thing about you," Kestrel replied. Something almost like the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. Said if Corinne Whitmore's daughter was even half the shooter her mother was, he wanted to see it for himself before he'd believe a word of it. For the first time in 18 years, Sloane felt something shift inside her chest, something that wasn't grief and wasn't quite hope either, but sat somewhere useful between the two. Momentum. "There's something else," Kestrel said, his voice dropping lower. careful now in a way that told Sloane whatever came next mattered more than anything he'd said so far. Something you need to know before you go any further down this particular road, because once you know it, there's no unknowing it. What? Ashworth isn't just active duty anymore, Kestrel said. I did some digging of my own last night, after I got off the phone with Ray. He's overseeing officer for this entire training command now, which means somewhere in the chain directly above me, above this whole base, above every single person standing on this range right now, including you. The words settled over Sloane like cold water, finding every gap in her clothing at once. He's here, she said. Close, closer than I ever imagined. Closer than either of us would like, Kestrel said. Which means, from this point forward, Sloane, you don't say his name out loud anywhere on this base again. Not to Casey, not to anyone. You understand me completely? She nodded slowly, the weight of the instructions settling into her bones alongside everything else she'd carried since finding that box under her grandmother's bed. But somewhere behind her ribs, that locked door she'd kept bolted for 18 years had finally cracked open, and there was no closing it again now, not with her mother's voice still echoing in her ears every single time she breathed out and waited, not with a name like Ashworth sitting somewhere above her in a chain of command she'd trusted without question until 3 days ago. Breathe out, then wait, except she was done waiting. She understood that now, standing at the edge of a tree line, with a man who had spent 18 years carrying his own version of the same guilt she was only just beginning to understand, she was going to find out exactly what happened to Corinne Whitmore. Even if the truth was standing somewhere on this very base, wearing more rank than anyone had ever bothered to question in nearly 2 decades. Even if it cost her everything she had left to give. That night, she sat once more on Ruth's porch, the metal box open between them, the photograph of her mother's laughing face propped against the railing, where the porch light could catch it properly. I met someone today who knew her, Sloane said quietly. Dale Kestrel. He served with her 18 years ago. He said she found something in a supply chain that didn't add up, and 2 days after she reported it, she was gone. Ruth's hands resting in her lap went very still. 2 days, she repeated. 2 days, Sloane said. That's not an accident, Grandma. That's not a training mistake. That's someone making sure a problem disappeared before it could become anything bigger than it already was. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, watching the moth still throwing itself at the porch light, over and over, patient and doomed, and somehow still trying. I always wondered, Ruth said finally, why the officer who came to my door that day seemed so eager to close the conversation, so unwilling to answer even the simplest questions I had. I told myself it was grief protocol, training, the way institutions handle bad news so they don't have to sit in it any longer than necessary. And now, Ruth turned to look at her granddaughter, and in the porch light Sloane could see, for the first time, in as long as she could remember, something other than grief moving across the old woman's face, something that looked unmistakably like resolve. Now, Ruth said, I think it's time we finally find out who that officer was working so hard to protect. Don't you? Sloane reached over and took her grandmother's hand, the same way she had 100 times on this exact porch, except this time the grip between them felt different, less like comfort offered to a grieving child, more like 2 women finally standing on the same side of a fight neither of them had chosen, but both of them, after 18 long years, were finally ready to finish. Ray Holcomb's house sat at the end of a dirt road that didn't appear on any map Sloane had ever used, tucked behind a curtain of live oaks dripping Spanish moss. The kind of place a man chooses when he's spent 30 years, learning exactly how many ways there are for someone to find you if you don't make it difficult on purpose. Kestrel parked the truck at the edge of the property, gravel crunching under the tires, and cut the engine. For a moment neither of them moved, the silence of the pine woods settling around them, thick and complete, broken only by the distant call of a mockingbird working through its repertoire somewhere in the dark. Couple things before we go in, Kestrel said, hands still resting on the wheel. Ray doesn't trust easy, doesn't trust fast, and he sure as hell doesn't trust anyone who comes asking about closed cases without earning it a little first. Earning it, Sloane repeated. Figure of speech, mostly. She looked at the house ahead. A single porch light burning against the dark, the same steady, patient glow her grandmother had kept alive for 18 years, and for a strange, disorienting moment, Sloane felt as though she were looking at a mirror of her own life, another person somewhere waiting for someone who might never come home. "Let's go," she said. Because waiting in a truck accomplished nothing. Because 18 years of waiting had already cost her more than she was willing to keep paying without a fight. Ray Holcomb opened the door before they'd even reached the porch steps, as though he'd been watching their headlights swing up the drive from some window. Sloane hadn't noticed. 71 years old, built like a man who'd once carried considerably more weight than his current frame suggested, and had never quite lost the habit of standing as though he still did. White hair cropped close to his skull, eyes the pale, flat blue of a lake in deep winter, the particular color of eyes that had learned long ago not to widen at anything, no matter how surprising. He looked at Sloane for a long moment, longer than felt entirely comfortable, long enough that she felt the urge to speak simply to fill the silence stretching between them. She didn't. "You've got her eyes," Holcomb said, finally. "Whose? Don't play games with me, young lady. I spent 3 decades reading people for a living, mostly people who were actively lying to my face while they did it. You know exactly whose eyes I mean." Something in Sloane's chest folded inward, quiet and sudden, like a page turning somewhere deep inside her. "You knew my mother." "I knew of her," Holcomb said, stepping back from the doorway to let them pass, which, in this particular line of work, sometimes ends up meaning a great deal more than knowing someone outright ever does. He gestured them inside. "Come in, both of you, and wipe your feet on that mat." "My wife's been gone 6 years now, and I still can't bring myself to let anyone track mud through what used to be her kitchen." The kitchen table was covered in files by the time midnight came and went. Real files, some of them pulled from cardboard boxes in Holcomb's garage that he swore, with the particular defensiveness of a man who knew he was breaking at least one rule he wasn't technically supposed to still possess. Photocopies of documents that had crossed his desk decades earlier and never quite left his memory afterward. The way certain cases refuse to leave a person, sitting in the gut like a splinter, buried too deep to ever fully dig out. "Task Force Sable," Holcomb said, tapping a manila folder with one thick finger, the nail cracked and yellowed with age. "First time I heard that name, I was working a fraud case out of a naval logistics command down the coast. Supply discrepancies, small stuff on paper at first glance. Ammunition counts that didn't reconcile properly. Weapons that existed on inventory sheets and absolutely nowhere else on God's earth." "That's exactly what my mother found," Sloane said, leaning forward. "I know," Holcomb said quietly, "because I pulled the thread from a different angle entirely. Years after her, and it led me straight to a name I was told, very politely and very firmly, to stop pulling at. Ashworth." Holcomb's expression didn't change, which told Sloane a great deal more than any visible reaction ever could have. "You already know that name," she said. "I know it," Holcomb said, slowly. "I know it the way a person knows an old scar. It doesn't hurt anymore. Not exactly. But you never once forget precisely where it came from, or how much it hurt on the day it was made." Kestrel leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "Ray, tell her what you told me on the phone last night." Holcomb exhaled, long and slow, the kind of breath a man takes before finally saying something he's held on to for far too many years to count easily. "Task Force Sable was never a real unit," he said. "No official designation anywhere in the records. No standing orders. It existed on paper as a logistics support detachment, which meant it could move equipment between bases without attracting the kind of scrutiny a genuine combat unit would draw, which means somebody built it specifically to remain invisible, brick by careful brick, over a period of years. Who built it? That's exactly where the trail went cold, Holcomb said. Every time I got close to a name that mattered, the case got reassigned, reclassified, or I got reassigned instead. 3 times in 18 months, which for a man who'd spent the previous decade working the same stretch of coastline without complaint, felt considerably less like ordinary career development, and considerably more like a message being sent directly to me. And Ashworth. Ashworth's name showed up on transfer manifests, Holcomb said. Signatures, authorizations, nothing on its own that would hold up cleanly in a courtroom. but enough that when I mentioned his name to my supervisor at the time, I was told, very calmly and very clearly, to focus my attention elsewhere for the good of my own career. Sloane's hands had gone still on the table, flat against the wood, as though she needed the surface to remain solid under her palms. My mother died 18 years ago, she said. You're telling me this has been going on that long? Longer, maybe. I'm telling you, Holcomb said, that whatever your mother found back then wasn't the beginning of anything. It was already the middle of something, which means it's very likely still continuing right now, 20-some years later, wearing a different name and commanding a considerably larger operation than anyone back then could have fully imagined. The kitchen went quiet, except for the hum of an old refrigerator, and, somewhere out in the dark yard, the low, occasional bark of Holcomb's dog at nothing in particular. There's something else, Holcomb said. He reached into the bottom of the box and withdrew a single photograph. Its edges soft, its corners bent, in the same way Ruth's folder had been bent, the particular wear that comes from a hand unable to decide, over many years, whether to finally keep something or finally burn it. He slid it across the table. Sloane looked down. A group of 5 people stood in front of a hangar somewhere, palm trees rising behind them, dressed in field uniforms, squinting into a sun that had probably set on that particular afternoon 2 decades ago, and, in some sense, never risen again on whoever those 5 people used to be before everything changed. Her mother stood in the center, younger than the photograph in Ruth's box, laughing at something outside the frame, the same open, unguarded laugh Sloane had never once witnessed in real life, only in photographs like this one, fragments of a woman she was only beginning to reconstruct. This was taken 3 weeks before she disappeared, Holcomb said. Sloane's breath caught somewhere high in her chest. Disappeared. Holcomb looked at her steadily, his pale eyes giving nothing away. You said died, Sloane whispered. I said what the file said, Holcomb replied evenly. I never once said I believed it. Sloane didn't sleep that night either. She sat at Ruth's kitchen table at 2 a.m, with the photograph propped against a coffee mug she'd forgotten to drink from, staring at her mother's laughing face until the lines of it blurred and reformed and blurred again in the lamplight. Disappeared. Not died. Disappeared. A word with edges. A word that opened a door Sloane had spent 18 years nailing shut with careful, deliberate hands, because dead was final. Dead was something a person could eventually learn to grieve and carry forward. But disappeared left room. Disappeared left the terrible, dangerous possibility of hope, and hope, Sloane was beginning to understand, could be its own particular kind of cruelty when it arrived 18 years too late to matter in any of the ways it once might have. She thought about Ruth, asleep down the hall, finally free of one secret, only to have a second one crack open directly behind it. She thought about Casey Doyle's careful, blocky handwriting on a folded diner napkin. She thought about a truck idling in a parking lot with its headlights off, waiting for reasons she still couldn't fully explain. She thought about her mother's voice. Breathe out, then wait. Except waiting had never once given her an actual answer. Only more silence, dressed up in a slightly different shape each time it arrived. At 4 a.m, she finally called Kestrel, unable to hold the question inside her chest a single hour longer. I want to know everything about that photograph, she said, before he'd even finished saying hello on the other end of the line. Every name, every face. I want to know who's still alive, Dale, and I want to know tonight. There was a pause on the line, long enough that Sloane briefly wondered if she'd woken him into a silence he simply didn't know how to fill. Sloane, he said finally, his voice thick with sleep and something else underneath it. There's something Ray didn't say last night. He wanted to be certain first, before he said it out loud to anyone. He called me an hour ago, after you'd already gone to bed. Her stomach dropped before her mind had even fully caught up to why it should. What? He ran the faces in that photograph through some old contacts of his, Kestrel said. Databases he's not technically supposed to have access to anymore, if we're being fully honest about the situation. 4 of the 5 people in that picture are confirmed dead. Natural causes, mostly, time simply doing what time eventually does to everyone. And the 5th, another pause, longer this time, heavy enough that Sloane could hear her own pulse in her ears while she waited for him to continue. The fifth, Kestrel said slowly, has a social security number that's been active for the last 6 years under a different last name entirely, filing taxes out of a small town 200 miles from here. Sloane's hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles went white and aching. Dale, she said. Who is it? Ray's sending over an address, Kestrel said. But Sloane, before you go anywhere near it, I need you to understand something clearly. And I need you to actually hear me when I say it. What? If the fifth person in that photograph is who I think it might be, Kestrel said, his voice dropping into something careful, something almost gentle, in a way she hadn't heard from him before, then somebody has spent 18 years making very certain you'd never find her. The town was called Millhaven, small enough that its entire downtown fit inside 4 short blocks, the kind of place where the diner and the hardware store and the little white church at the corner all knew each other's business a great deal better than they knew their own. Sloane drove there alone the following afternoon, because some things a person simply had to do without an audience, even a well-meaning one, even one that had already earned the right to be present. Ray Holcomb's information led her to a modest house on the edge of town, white paint gone gray, at the corners from years of weather, a small garden out front that somebody clearly tended with a patience Sloane had never quite managed for anything in her own life, rows of tomatoes and marigolds planted in careful, deliberate lines. She sat in her car across the street for 11 full minutes before she found the courage to finally get out, because what did a person even say? What could possibly be said, standing on a stranger's porch, facing a woman who might, impossibly, be your own mother, back from a grave that had apparently never held her at all? She walked to the door anyway, before her nerve could fail her entirely, knocked 3 times, footsteps, slow and measured, approaching from somewhere inside, the soft sound of a chain sliding back from its latch. The door opened, and Sloane's entire world tilted sideways on its axis. Because the woman standing in the doorway had gray, now threading through dark hair that used to be, Sloane understood instantly, exactly the same shade as her own. Because the lines around her eyes had deepened in all the particular ways that 18 years does to a face that has spent most of that time being careful, being quiet, being someone other than who she actually was. But the eyes themselves, the eyes were entirely unmistakable, wide-set, gray-blue, the same eyes Sloane saw reflected back at her in the mirror every single morning of her life, without ever once understanding their true origin. The woman's face went completely white. Sloane, she whispered. Not a question, a name spoken like a prayer someone had, over many years quietly stopped believing, would ever actually be answered. Sloane couldn't speak, couldn't move. 18 years of grief, of buried anger, of porch steps and closed caskets and a metal box locked under a bed, all of it rising up through her chest at once, until she thought, for one dizzying moment, that it might genuinely break her open right there, on a stranger's doorstep, in a town she'd never once heard of before yesterday afternoon. You're supposed to be dead, Sloane finally managed, the words scraping their way out of her. The woman's eyes filled, overflowed, tears tracking down a face Sloane was only just beginning to recognize as her own future, decades removed. I know, Corinne Whitmore said. I know, baby. I'm so sorry. I know exactly what I let you believe. They sat in Corinne's kitchen for 3 hours, that stretched and folded and doubled back upon themselves, because 18 years doesn't fold neatly into a single afternoon, no matter how desperately 2 people might need it to. I found something, Corinne said, her hands wrapped tight around a coffee mug she never once actually drank from. 18 years ago, equipment discrepancies, small amounts moving through supply chains that simply didn't add up on paper, no matter how many times I ran the numbers. I told my chain of command. 2 nights later, someone came to my quarters after dark. Ashworth. Not him directly, Corinne said. A man who worked for him. Someone whose name I still don't fully know to this day. He didn't threaten me outright. Not exactly. Not in words a person could easily repeat afterward. He was very calm, very reasonable, in that particular way that frightens a person far more than shouting ever could. He told me that some things were considerably bigger than one officer's individual career, and that if I kept pulling at threads I clearly didn't fully understand, I might not like what eventually came unraveled. And then, he told me I had a daughter, Corinne said, her voice cracking for the first time since Sloane had arrived. 6 years old, my little girl. He knew what school you attended. He knew what time your grandmother picked you up each afternoon. And I understood, in that single terrible moment, exactly what kind of man I was truly dealing with, and exactly how much power he actually held over everything I loved. Sloane's breath went shallow, her chest tight. So you disappeared. I staged an accident, Corinne said, with help from someone inside the investigation itself, a man who believed me completely, who believed everything I'd found, and who was frightened enough of what might happen if the truth ever fully surfaced, that he agreed to help me, vanish entirely rather than fight a battle he was certain, at the time, we would both eventually lose. Who helped you? Corinne hesitated, her eyes dropping to the table. A young officer, junior grade, barely older than you are now. He falsified a casualty report, arranged transportation, built me a new identity solid enough to survive 18 years of quiet scrutiny. He believed that if I disappeared cleanly enough, Ashworth would have no remaining reason to come after you and your grandmother. A dead woman poses no further threat to anyone. A woman still actively fighting poses one every single day she keeps breathing. So you let us bury you, Sloane said, and the words came out, sharper than she'd intended, sharper than she'd known she still possessed the capacity to be after all these years. You let Grandma carry a folded flag for 18 years, Mom. You let me grow up, believing my own mother made a careless mistake that got her killed on a range with no witnesses. You let me hate you, without ever once knowing I was even allowed to. Corinne flinched as though she'd been struck, the words landing exactly where Sloane had intended. I know, she said quietly. I know precisely what I let both of you believe every single day for 18 years. And I have told myself, every single one of those days, that it was the only way to keep you both alive. But I also know, Sloane, that knowing my reasons doesn't make the wound any smaller for you now. I don't expect it to. I never once expected forgiveness to come easily, if it ever comes at all. Silence stretched between them, thick and unfamiliar, two women who shared a face and a history, and 18 years of separation that neither of them had ever chosen, and both of them had somehow, against considerable odds, managed to survive. Why now? Sloane finally asked. Why haven't you ever once tried to reach us? Not a letter, not a phone call from some blocked number in the middle of the night. Nothing at all, in 18 entire years. Because I was watched, Corinne said. For years, I believe, though I could never be fully certain when it finally stopped, or if it ever truly did stop at all. And because every single day I stayed away from you, I told myself it was one more day you were genuinely safe from all of this. Sloane looked down at her own hands, and then, slowly, at her mother's hands resting across the table. The same hands, she realized with a jolt. The same fingers, the same particular callus along the trigger finger that comes only from a lifetime spent behind a rifle stock, year after year after year. I've been shooting, Sloane said quietly, for work. Training SEALs down at Camp Alderwood. Everyone keeps telling me I have a gift they've never quite seen before. Not from anyone. Corinne's eyes filled again, and this time she let the tears fall freely down her face without trying to stop them. You have your father's steadiness, she said softly, and my eye, I think. I used to dream, back when I still allowed myself to dream about it at all, about teaching you properly someday, once it was finally safe. I never once imagined someday would end up taking 18 entire years to arrive. You still could, Sloane said, before she'd fully decided to say the words out loud. Corinne looked up at her, startled, something fragile moving across her face. Teach me, Sloane said, the rest of it. Whatever you never got the proper chance to. And for the first time since the door had opened that afternoon, something like hope moved slowly across Corinne Whitmore's face, fragile and entirely unfamiliar, like a muscle that hadn't been used in 18 years, and wasn't at all certain it still remembered how to work. Kestrel met Sloane at Camp Alderwood 2 days later with an expression on his face that told her, before he'd said a single word, that whatever news he carried wasn't going to make any part of this situation simpler. Ray dug deeper into current supply manifests. Kestrel said, walking beside her along the tree line, where they'd first spoken Ashworth's name out loud days earlier. Cross-reference Task Force Sable's old patterns against the current transfer logs across 3 different training commands along this coast. And the pattern's back, Kestrel said grimly. Same signature style. Small discrepancies, spread thin enough to avoid triggering any automatic review process. Except this time, it's not merely ammunition and small arms anymore. Whoever's running it now has access to something considerably bigger. How much bigger? Explosive ordnance, Kestrel said, and the words seemed to hang in the humid morning air between them. Diverted in amounts small enough to consistently pass routine inspection, but large enough that, over roughly 18 months, someone's managed to accumulate a stockpile that shouldn't legally exist anywhere outside a properly secured armory. Sloane's stomach turned over completely. Ashworth's still running it, she said. 20 years later, bigger now, considerably more dangerous. That's the working theory, Kestrel said. But Sloane, there's something else. Something Ray found buried in a personnel file he wasn't technically supposed to still have access to. What? Kestrel stopped walking entirely, turned to face her fully, in the deliberate way he only did when he needed her complete and undivided attention before saying something that genuinely mattered. You've got a trainee, he said, Casey Doyle, the one who's been quietly helping you. Sloane's chest tightened painfully. What about him? His father served under Ashworth's command, Kestrel said. 19 years ago, Master Sergeant Robert Doyle died in what was officially recorded as a training accident during equipment testing at a facility that no longer exists on any current base roster anywhere. Sloane felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Casey doesn't know, she said. It wasn't a question at all. It arrived as a certainty, whole and immediate, the way certain devastating truths sometimes do. No, Kestrel said quietly. As far as Ray can tell, Casey's entire life, he's believed his father died precisely the way the Navy told his mother he died. A hero lost to a genuine accident that nobody could have possibly prevented. And instead, Kestrel said, it looks very much like his father found something. The same something your mother found, roughly 1 year earlier, at a different facility entirely. And it looks like he died the exact same way she was originally supposed to die. Except somebody actually let him die. Sloane. Nobody helped him disappear the way your mother's contact helped her. Sloane closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere behind her ribs, something painful and enormous settled slowly into place. A weight she hadn't previously known, she still had room left to carry. Casey, sweet, earnest, freckle-faced Casey, who had slid a folded napkin across a diner table because he trusted her enough to hand her a thread that might have easily gotten him discharged for pulling at it without proper authorization. Casey, who had no idea whatsoever that he was standing in almost exactly the spot where his own father once stood, one careless discovery away from an identical fate. He can't know, Sloane said. Not yet. Not until we fully understand exactly what we're dealing with here. He deserves to know eventually, Kestrel said. I know, Sloane said, her voice barely above a whisper. But if Ashworth so much as suspects that Casey knows anything at all, he becomes a target the exact same way my mother became one. The exact same way Robert Doyle became one. I won't let that happen to him, Dale. Not while there's still a way I can protect him from it. Kestrel studied her for a long, quiet moment. You sound like your mother, he said finally, his voice softening. The exact same conviction in your voice. The exact same refusal to let someone else pay the price for a truth you're the one chasing. Sloane looked out across the range, toward the 400-yard mark, toward a horizon that suddenly felt considerably heavier than it had only 4 days earlier. Then I suppose I finally understand her, she said quietly. 18 years too late to tell her so. That evening, Sloane sat with her mother in Corinne's small kitchen in Millhaven, a rifle disassembled carefully on newspaper between them, cleaning rods and solvent and the quiet, methodical rhythm of a ritual 18 years overdue finally taking place. Tell me about him, Sloane said. Without looking up from the barrel, she was carefully running a patch through. Robert Doyle. Corinne's hands went still over the cloth she'd been holding. You know, that name, his son is one of my trainees, Sloane said. A good kid, 24 years old, freckles across his nose, the kind of face that hasn't been rearranged by real disappointment yet. He has absolutely no idea his father was murdered for finding the exact same thing you found. Corinne set the cloth down entirely, her hands trembling now in a way she made no effort to hide. Robert served with your father, she said quietly. Before your father passed away, when you were still very small. They were close friends, the kind of friendship that forms between men who've trusted each other with their lives more than once. When I found the discrepancies in the supply chain, Robert was the one who helped me verify the pattern across multiple bases. He believed me from the very beginning, back when almost no one else did, and Ashworth found out. Robert died 4 months after I disappeared, Corinne said, her voice hollow now. I read about it years later, in a newspaper archive, searching under a name I wasn't technically supposed to still be searching for at all. Training accident, equipment failure, the exact same language they used to describe my own death. Before I made absolutely certain that particular ending never actually happened to me, except it happened to him instead. Yes, Corinne said, it happened to him, and I have carried that, Sloane, every single day, since I first found that article online. Because if I had come forward sooner, if I had fought harder, louder, instead of simply disappearing to protect you, perhaps Robert Doyle would still be alive today. Perhaps his son would have grown up with an actual father, instead of a folded flag and a lie he never once had reason to question. Sloane reached across the table and took her mother's hand, the same way Ruth had once taken hers on a porch step. 2 full generations of women finally learning how to hold each other's grief together, instead of carrying it entirely alone. You can't fix what happened to him, Sloane said gently, but we can make absolutely certain it doesn't happen again. To Casey, or to anyone else who happens to stand in the way of whatever Ashworth is building now. Corinne looked up, something fierce and unmistakably familiar moving behind her eyes. Then we finish what I started, she said, properly this time. Together, the way it should have happened from the very beginning. Ray Holcomb's kitchen table had become something closer to a genuine war room. By the end of that particular week, files spread across every available surface. A corkboard borrowed from Kestrel's garage, propped carefully against the wall, string connecting names and dates and transfer, manifests in a pattern that was finally, painfully, beginning to make complete sense. Here's what we know for certain, Holcomb said, tapping the board with one thick finger. Ashworth's been running diverted equipment through a chain of small, deliberate discrepancies for over 20 years now. Started small, patient, careful, grew smarter as the years passed, and somewhere along the way, he stopped being satisfied with small arms and ordinary ammunition. Explosive ordnance, Sloane said. Explosive ordnance, Holcomb confirmed grimly, which raises an obvious and rather troubling question. What does a man who's already comfortable, already high-ranking, already 20 years deep into a career he could easily coast through until a well-funded retirement, actually need with a hidden stockpile of military-grade explosives? Nobody answered right away. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, the dog barked once and fell silent again. There's a graduation ceremony coming up, Kestrel said finally, his voice quiet. 2 weeks from today, the full training class, all 180 of them, gathered together in one place for the culminating exercise before deployment assignments finally go out to each of them. The room went very still. You think he's planning something, Sloane said. I think, Kestrel said slowly, that a man who has spent 20 years quietly making inconvenient people disappear doesn't accumulate that much explosive material for no reason at all. And I think if there's ever been a single moment where covering his tracks and eliminating every remaining loose end mattered more to him than at any point in the last 2 decades, it's precisely right now. While your mother is alive again, and both of you are actively pulling at threads he genuinely believed were buried for good. So we stop him, Corinne said, her voice steady in a way that made Sloane understand, finally and completely, exactly where her own steadiness under pressure had originally come from. Before that ceremony ever takes place, we find real proof, something undeniable, enough evidence to bring to someone who cannot be bought or reassigned or quietly silenced the way so many others have been over the years. That's considerably easier said than done, Holcomb said. 20 years and nobody's managed it successfully yet, myself included. 20 years, Corinne said evenly, and nobody's had what we currently have sitting on this table. Sloane looked around the room, at Kestrel, 61 years old, finally unburdening a guilt he'd quietly carried since the day he'd been cascaded across the country for daring to ask the wrong questions at the wrong time. At Holcomb, 71, still fighting a case he'd been formally ordered to abandon 3 decades earlier. At her mother, alive against every reasonable expectation, sitting across a kitchen table with hands that shook slightly from 18 years of careful hiding and had finally stopped hiding entirely. What do we actually have? Sloane asked. Corinne reached into a canvas bag at her feet and withdrew a small, worn notebook, its pages soft with age, the handwriting inside cramped and urgent, the particular handwriting of a woman who had been racing, all those years ago, against a clock she'd already known was ticking down towards something terrible. My original findings, Corinne said. Everything I carefully documented before I was forced to disappear. Names, dates, serial numbers, cross-referenced by hand. I never once got the chance to properly hand this over to anyone capable of acting on it. I've kept it safe for 18 years, waiting for a moment I could finally trust enough people to actually use it correctly. She slid the notebook across the table toward the center of the group. I believe that moment is now, she said. 2 nights later, Sloane sat alone on her grandmother's porch, the same step she'd occupied as a child, waiting once more for headlights that never came, except this time Ruth sat beside her, and the headlights she was actually waiting for now belonged to a mother who had, against every impossible odd, finally come home. I still can't quite believe it, Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion she'd clearly stopped trying to hide. 18 years, Sloane, and she was alive the entire time, living just 200 miles away from us. She did it to protect us, Sloane said. I understand that now, even if understanding it doesn't make the anger disappear entirely. I don't know if I fully forgive her yet, but I understand her reasons now, in a way I couldn't have a week ago. Ruth reached over and took her granddaughter's hand in both of her own weathered ones. Understanding, she said softly, is usually exactly where forgiveness begins, even when it doesn't feel like nearly enough on its own. Headlights swept slowly across the gravel driveway. Corinne's car, pulling in careful and slow, the particular caution of someone who still isn't entirely certain she's allowed to be standing wherever she currently finds herself. She stepped out, stood at the base of the porch steps, looking up at the 2 women who had spent 18 entire years believing, with absolute certainty, that she was gone forever. I brought something, Corinne said, holding up a small rifle case. I thought, if you're both willing to have me, perhaps it's finally time I taught my daughter the rest of what I never got the proper chance to teach her. Ruth's eyes filled completely. She looked at Sloane, then back toward her own daughter, standing in the dark yard with a rifle case in her hands and 18 years of unspoken apology written plainly across her tired face. Well, Ruth said, her voice unsteady but undeniably warm. Don't just stand there in the dark all night, Corinne. Come up here and sit with your family, where you belong. And for the first time in 18 long years, 3 generations of women sat together on that small porch, beneath a light that had never once stopped burning through all that time, waiting patiently for exactly this particular moment to finally arrive. But 2 weeks, Sloane understood clearly, was not very much time at all, and somewhere across the county, in an office with a clear view of the same tree line, Sloane trained beside every single morning without fail, Colonel Grant Ashworth sat reviewing a routine security report that had flagged unusual access patterns to a set of archived personnel files. Files belonging to a woman officially listed as Sloane Whitmore, deceased. He set the report down slowly, his expression giving nothing away to the empty room around him, folded his hands together on the desk, stared out the window at a horizon that had 20 years earlier swallowed one particular loose end so cleanly that he'd very nearly stopped bothering to be afraid of it ever resurfacing. He picked up his phone. "It's me," he said, when the line finally connected. "We have a problem. The kind of problem I genuinely believed I'd buried a very long time ago." A pause on the other end. "No," he said, "not merely the mother. It's worse than that. It looks as though the mother is no longer the only one asking questions I'd prefer stayed unasked." He glanced at a second file resting on his desk, a photograph clipped neatly to the front cover, taken during a routine training exercise months earlier. A young woman kneeling behind a rifle, 400 yards from a steel target she'd struck dead center on her very first attempt. Find out everything you can about a civilian contractor named Sloane Whitmore, Ashworth said, his voice flat and precise. And find it fast. Because if she's even half as capable as her file currently suggests, we have considerably less time remaining than I would prefer. He hung up the phone, looked out the window one final time, toward a graduation ceremony that had now, in his own calculating mind, stopped being a mere formality to be quietly endured. It had become, in the space of a single afternoon, an absolute deadline. And somewhere, on the other side of that tree line, 180 young men going about their ordinary training routines had absolutely no idea they had just become collateral in a war that had started long before most of them were even born, a war about to reach its final, dangerous chapter. 10 days. That was what remained between Sloane Whitmore and the graduation ceremony that Colonel Grant Ashworth had, in the space of a single phone call, quietly transformed from formality into deadline. 10 days to prove 20 years of buried evidence. 10 days to protect a mother who had only just returned from the dead. 10 days to keep a freckled 24-year-old named Casey Doyle from becoming the second member of his own family, erased by a man with too much rank and far too little conscience. Sloane stood at her kitchen counter at 5 in the morning, coffee gone cold in her hand, staring at a corkboard she'd smuggled home from Holcomb's garage, because some nights the war room simply had to travel with her, whether she wanted the weight of it in her own house or not. Names, dates, a photograph of 5 people standing in front of a hangar 20 years ago, 4 of them dead now, 1 of them finally, miraculously, alive and sitting on a porch that had waited 18 years to hold her again. And Ashworth, always Ashworth, a name that had gone from a redacted signature on a supply manifest to a living, breathing threat with a security clearance high enough to make loose ends vanish without a trace. Her phone buzzed against the counter, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. Kestrel. 6 words, no punctuation wasted. Something's wrong. Get here now. She was in her truck before she finished reading the message twice. Camp Alderwood at 5:30 in the morning looked the way it always looked. Quiet, gray light easing slowly over the tree line. A base full of young men who had no idea. Their instructor was currently driving 11 miles over the posted speed limit, because the man who trained them had just sent a message that made her stomach drop straight through the floor of the truck. She found Kestrel outside the supply depot, standing very still, the particular stillness of a man trying hard not to draw attention to how alarmed he actually was underneath. "What?" she said, before she'd even fully parked, throwing the door open. "Inventory audit," Kestrel said quietly. "Announced this morning, effective immediately. Full sweep of every training facility under this entire command. That's not unusual, is it? Routine audits happen all the time." "Not like this one," Kestrel said. "This one's being run directly out of Ashworth's office, bypassing the normal chain entirely. And it's not only inventory, Sloane. It's personnel files, too. Every civilian contractor's background check is getting pulled for immediate review, including yours." Sloane's blood went cold. "He knows," she said. "I don't know exactly what he knows," Kestrel said. "But I know precisely what this looks like. It looks like a man clearing the floor before he does something he doesn't particularly want witnesses standing around for." Sloane looked past him, toward the training field where, in 9 days, 180 young men would gather for a ceremony that suddenly felt considerably less like a milestone and considerably more like a target painted directly onto the ground beneath their feet. "We need to move faster," she said. "We need to move smarter," Kestrel corrected. "A man like Ashworth doesn't panic, Sloane. He adjusts, and right now every single thing we do gets noticed by someone. Which means from this point forward, nothing goes through official channels. Nothing gets typed on a base computer. Nothing gets said inside a building, with cameras mounted anywhere near the ceiling." Sloane exhaled slowly, forcing her heart rate down through sheer discipline. "Ray's house," she said. "Ray's house," Kestrel agreed. "Tonight, bring your mother with you." The war room in Ray Holcomb's kitchen had grown considerably since the last time Sloane sat at that particular table. More string stretched across the corkboard now, more photographs pinned carefully in rows. A timeline stretching back 20 full years, connecting a young officer's death to a woman's staged disappearance, to a stockpile of explosive ordnance nobody outside this single room seemed to know existed at all. Corinne stood at the head of the table, her notebook open in front of her, 20 years of cramped handwriting finally laid bare under a single overhead bulb. I've cross-referenced the current transfer manifests against my original findings from 18 years ago, she said. The pattern is nearly identical, almost unnervingly so. Small discrepancies, multiple facilities involved. Except the final destination point is entirely new this time. What destination point? Sloane asked, leaning over the table. Corinne pulled a folder from the pile and slid it across toward her daughter. A private storage facility, she said, registered under a shell company that took Ray nearly 2 full days to trace back to anything real. Every diverted shipment for the last 18 months has routed through it before disappearing entirely from any official record anywhere. Holcomb leaned forward, studying the folder with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read exactly this kind of paper trail. That's not a smuggling operation moving steadily toward profit, he said slowly. That's a stockpile, plain and simple. Someone is building an arsenal, not slowly selling one off piece by piece to interested buyers. For what purpose? Kestrel asked. Nobody answered right away. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere out in the dark yard, the dog shifted and settled again, because none of them particularly wanted to say the thing that had been sitting, unspoken, at the very center of that table since the moment they'd first learned about the graduation ceremony deadline looming ahead of them. He's not planning to sell it, Corinne finally said, her voice quiet but entirely certain. He's planning to use it soon. And I believe all of us already know exactly which date he's circled on his calendar. The room went silent except for the refrigerator's steady hum and the distant, muffled bark of Holcomb's dog somewhere out in the dark. We need proof, Sloane said. Real proof. Enough to bring directly to someone outside this entire command structure. Someone Ashworth cannot reassign or intimidate or quietly bury the way he's buried everyone else for 20 years. I still have contacts, Holcomb said. People I trust from the old days before all of this began. But contacts aren't really the core problem here. The problem is time. Building a case that actually survives scrutiny usually takes months, sometimes longer. We have 9 days remaining. The graduation ceremony is in 9 days, Sloane said. If he's genuinely planning what we all believe he's planning, we don't have the luxury of a slow, careful process this time. Then we do both at once, Corinne said firmly. We hand over the evidence we already have tonight, to start the proper wheels turning through legitimate channels. And we personally make certain, no matter what else happens along the way, that ceremony never takes place the exact way Ashworth currently intends it to. Casey Doyle found Sloane at the medical training trailer the following morning, his freckled face drawn tight with something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine fear. Ma'am, he said, closing the door carefully behind him. I need to tell you something, and I need you to not ask me exactly how I know it. Sloane's pulse quickened immediately. Go ahead. There's chatter going around the base, Casey said, about increased security measures for graduation. Not normal increased security, the kind we usually see for a ceremony like this. The kind of increased security that comes bundled with restricted access, additional personnel sweeps, K9 units brought in special from outside the command entirely. That could just be standard precaution, Sloane said, even as her stomach twisted tighter with the growing certainty that it wasn't anything of the sort. Except one of the K9 handlers happens to be a buddy of mine, Casey said, and he mentioned, off the record, that they're being specifically briefed on explosive detection. Not drugs, not weapons in the general sense we usually train for. Explosives specifically, at a ceremony that has never once needed that particular kind of screening in the 11 years this base has existed. Sloane's blood ran cold straight through her chest, because if Ashworth had somehow learned about the break-in at the storage facility, and if he now understood his hidden stockpile had been photographed and properly documented, the smartest, most ruthless move available to a man like him wasn't to abandon his plan entirely. It was to accelerate it. Before the evidence could finish making its slow way through proper legal channels, before anyone with real authority could stop him in time. Casey, Sloane said slowly, I need to tell you something now, and I need you to trust me completely while I do. He looked at her, uncertain, sensing the sudden shift in her voice. Your father, Sloane said. Master Sergeant Robert Doyle. Casey's face went pale beneath his freckles. How do you know about my father? He didn't die in an accident, Sloane said gently, the same way my own family was told a comfortable lie about how my mother died. There's a man on this base, Casey. A man with more rank than anyone has ever bothered to properly question, who has spent 20 years erasing people who got too close to something he desperately needed to keep hidden. Casey sank slowly into the chair across from her desk, his hands beginning to shake. My father found something, he said slowly, the pieces visibly assembling themselves in real time behind his eyes. Didn't he? That's what actually happened. Yes, Sloane said gently. The exact same thing my mother found 1 year earlier, at a different facility entirely. A supply chain diversion that has grown, over 20 years, into something far larger and far more dangerous than either of them could have possibly imagined at the time. And now, Casey said, his voice barely above a whisper, you believe he's planning to actually use it at graduation, with everyone there. I believe, Sloane said carefully, that 180 of your classmates are about to stand together in one place, at one specific time, alongside a man who has already proven, more than once, that he'll do anything necessary to protect this secret, and I need your help to stop him before that happens. The Inspector General's investigator arrived. 4 days later, a woman named Patricia Renwick, sharp and entirely unhurried in the particular manner of someone who had spent an entire career learning that speed without diligence solves absolutely nothing in the end. She sat in Holcomb's kitchen for 6 full hours, reviewing 20 years of accumulated evidence, cross-referencing photographs against manifest numbers. With a magnifying glass she carried in her own briefcase, listening to Corinne's full account of her disappearance with an expression that gave away nothing whatsoever, until, finally, near the end of the 6th hour, she set down her pen and looked slowly around the table. This is credible, Renwick said. More than credible, honestly. This is precisely the kind of documentation that ends careers, and quite possibly results in serious criminal charges being filed. How fast can you actually move? Sloane asked. Not fast enough for what you're currently describing, Renwick said honestly. A formal investigation into a colonel with Ashworth's current standing takes real time to properly authorize. Weeks, typically, sometimes considerably longer, depending on how deeply entrenched the corruption turns out to be. We have 4 days remaining, Sloane said. Renwick studied her for a long, careful moment. Then here's what I can genuinely offer you, she said. I can authorize an immediate security review of the graduation ceremony itself, citing this evidence as probable cause for heightened concern. That much I can reasonably push through within 24 hours. It won't stop Ashworth from being exactly who Ashworth already is, but it will put considerably more eyes on that ceremony, eyes that answer directly to my office and not to his. That's not enough, Corinne said flatly. It's what's genuinely possible within the system. Moving as fast as the system can legally allow, Renwick said. If you want something faster than that, you're talking about operating outside proper channels entirely, and I strongly advise against that particular path, for reasons I sincerely hope are already obvious to everyone sitting at this table. Sloane looked at her mother, at Kestrel, at Holcomb, 71 years old, and still fighting a battle he'd first taken up 30 long years earlier without ever fully winning it. Then we'll take what's actually possible, Sloane said. And we'll make absolutely certain we're standing there too, in person, just in case possible turns out not to be quite enough. The morning of the graduation ceremony arrived gray and humid, the particular kind of Gulf Coast heat that settled into a person's chest before the sun had even finished properly rising, thick with the promise of an afternoon storm already building somewhere far out over the water. Sloane stood at the edge of the training field at 6 in the morning. Watching, the grounds crew set up long rows of folding chairs for families who would begin arriving in a few short hours. Families who had absolutely no idea that the ceremony they'd traveled to witness carried a danger none of them could see or even begin to imagine. Casey found her there, dressed in his formal uniform, his face pale beneath the familiar freckles. "Security sweep came back clean," he said. "Renwick's people went through absolutely everything last night, top to bottom. No explosive material detected anywhere on the grounds, not in any building, not in any vehicle." "That doesn't necessarily mean we're safe," Sloane said. "It only means whatever he's planning, he hasn't moved it into final position yet. He's waiting for the right moment. Then when—" "Today," Sloane said. "Sometime today, almost certainly. He can't risk waiting any longer. Not with an active investigation now formally attached to his name. Whatever he's ultimately going to do, he does it now, while there's still enough chaos to hide comfortably inside." Kestrel's voice crackled through the small earpiece. Sloane wore, hidden carefully beneath her hair, connected to a radio Holcomb, had rigged from surplus equipment that technically shouldn't have still worked half as well as it currently did. "Movement," Kestrel said, his voice tight. "Unmarked delivery truck, approaching the North Access Road right now. Not listed anywhere on today's manifest." Sloane's heart slammed hard against her ribs. "Location," she said, already moving fast across the field. "North Maintenance Building," Kestrel said. "Roughly 200 yards from the ceremony staging area." 200 yards. Close enough. Sloane's mind calculated instantly, cold and precise in exactly the way her mother had trained it to be over so many patient years. Close enough that whatever waited inside that truck could reach a crowd of 180 graduates and their families within minutes of being unloaded and properly positioned. "I'm moving toward it now," Sloane said. "Wait for backup," Kestrel said sharply. "Renwick's security team is 2 minutes out at most." 2 minutes might already be too long, Sloane said, and she was already running full speed across the wet grass. The North Maintenance Building sat quiet and entirely unremarkable behind a row of storage sheds. The unmarked delivery truck backed carefully up against its loading entrance. Engine still running, driver's side door hanging open at an angle that suggested someone had left in a considerable hurry. Sloane approached low, keeping tight to the tree line. Every single instinct her mother had ever drilled into her firing at once beneath her skin. Through the open loading door, she saw 2 men working fast, unloading heavy wooden crates, stenciled with the exact same code she'd photographed at the storage facility 4 nights earlier, Sable 7, and standing at the edge of the loading dock, overseeing the entire operation with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had never once, in 20 full years, been made to properly answer for anything he'd done, stood Colonel Grant Ashworth. Sloane's breath caught hard in her throat. He looked older in person than his file photograph had suggested. Silver threading fully through hair that had merely been graying in the older photograph Kestrel had shown her weeks earlier. But his eyes, when he turned and caught sight of her standing at the tree line, held exactly the kind of cold, calculated composure she would have expected from a man who had built his entire career on making inconvenient truths quietly disappear. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying easily across the loading dock, unbothered, almost pleasant in tone. "I wondered how long it would actually take you to find me here." "It's over, Colonel," Sloane said, stepping fully into view, her chin lifted. "The Inspector General already has your manifests, your signatures, photographic evidence of everything currently sitting inside that storage facility." Ashworth's expression didn't change even slightly. "Evidence," he said, almost thoughtfully, "is only ever as useful as the people left alive to properly testify to it in front of a tribunal." The words landed like a physical blow directly to Sloane's chest. "You're not walking away from this," Sloane said, her voice steadier than she actually felt inside. "No," Ashworth agreed, almost calmly. "I don't imagine that I am at this point, but I fully intend to make certain that whatever happens to me next happens entirely on my own terms, not the Inspector General's. And that means removing every remaining variable that might complicate my exit from this particular situation." He nodded once toward the crates behind him. "There's already a timing mechanism active," he said, "set to a schedule I won't be sharing with you. You can spend the next several minutes attempting to negotiate with me, if you'd like, Or you can spend them instead trying to save a graduation ceremony full of young men who have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any of this. Sloane's blood turned to ice in her veins. How much time? She demanded. Ashworth simply smiled, a thin, humorless expression that never once reached his eyes, and stepped back into the maintenance building, disappearing through a side door before Sloane could close the distance between them. She turned immediately toward the crates, toward the two men still working there, who froze at the sight of her, clearly uncertain whether to run or to fight. "Get out!" Sloane shouted, her voice carrying with full command authority. "Now! This entire building is about to go up." They didn't need to be told a second time. Sloane's hands moved fast over the first crate, prying it open with a strength she hadn't fully known she still had left in reserve, revealing a timing mechanism wired directly into the explosive charges, exactly as Ashworth had promised. Red digital numbers counted down, merciless and precise, indifferent entirely to everything at stake. 6 minutes, 41 seconds. Her mind raced through every possible scenario at once, training and pure instinct colliding together in a single, desperate calculation. Disarming a device like this one, properly and safely, took time she simply didn't have available. Evacuating an entire ceremony field full of families and graduates in under 7 minutes was, under even the very best circumstances, nearly impossible to accomplish, which left exactly one option remaining. The only option her mother's voice, echoing steadily through 18 years of memory, had ever truly prepared her to face. "Kestrel," she said into her earpiece, her voice fighting hard to stay level. "I need a full evacuation of the ceremony field now. No time to explain exactly why. Just move every single one of them." "Sloane." 6 minutes, she said. Maybe less. Multiple explosive devices. North Maintenance Building. Timing mechanism already active and counting down. "I can't disarm them in time, Dale." A pause, sharp and terrible on the other end of the line. "Then get out of that building right now," Kestrel said, his voice cracking with something Sloane had never once heard from him before in 3 full months of knowing him. Fear, raw and immediate and entirely unguarded. "Sloane, get out of there right now." "I can't," she said. "If I leave them here in position, the blast radius still reaches the ceremony field even after full evacuation. Families, children standing at the edges, people who haven't even had the chance to sit down yet." "Sloane, I have to move them," she said, already lifting the first crate with everything she had, away from the crowd entirely, "as far as I can possibly manage in the time I have left." "That's a death sentence," Kestrel said, and his voice broke completely on the very last word. Sloane looked down at the crates, at the countdown, ticking steadily downward with mechanical indifference to everything she personally stood to lose in the next 6 minutes. She thought of her mother 20 years ago, choosing to disappear entirely rather than let a genuine threat reach her own daughter. She thought of Robert Doyle, dying to protect a truth he'd only just barely uncovered. She thought of Casey, standing somewhere at the edge of that field in his formal uniform, 24 years old, and utterly unaware how close he'd come to losing absolutely everything for a second time in his young life. She thought of Ruth, on a porch that had burned a light every single night for 18 consecutive years, waiting patiently, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful despite everything, exactly what her mother's 4 simple words had been quietly preparing her for all along. Breathe out. Then wait. Except there was no more waiting left to do now. Not today. "Tell my mother I love her," Sloane said into the earpiece, already moving fast, already dragging the first crate toward loading dock with strength born entirely of pure desperation. "Tell Ruth the porch light finally did exactly what it was always meant to do." "Sloane, don't you dare." She cut the earpiece off entirely. There simply wasn't time left for goodbyes that might weaken her resolve at the exact moment she needed it most. There was only time left to move. 5 minutes remaining. Sloane hauled the first crate onto a maintenance cart, abandoned near the loading dock, muscles screaming in protest, mind racing through terrain. She'd studied on this base for 4 full months, without ever once imagining she'd genuinely need it for something like this. Behind the maintenance building, past a stand of pines, sat an old concrete bunker, remnant of some decommissioned training exercise from decades earlier, half collapsed now, and reinforced enough that it might, just might, absorb enough of a blast to spare the crowd waiting 200 yards away. It was the only structure close enough to reach in time, and solid enough to actually matter in the calculation she was running through her mind. She pushed the cart with absolutely everything she had left, wheels screeching hard against gravel, sweat and fear blurring together into a single, propulsive terror that somehow kept her moving forward instead of freezing entirely in place. 4 minutes. The second crate went onto the cart beside the first, heavier than she'd expected, every second stretching and compressing at once in her mind, time itself behaving like something liquid and cruel. 3 minutes. She reached the bunker, its collapsed concrete walls forming a rough horseshoe shape that might, if her hurried calculations held true, direct the force of the blast upward and outward, rather than sideways across the open field where evacuation was. She prayed silently, still fully underway. 2 minutes. She shoved the cart deep into the bunker's remains, positioning it carefully against the thickest remaining section of wall. Every single instinct her mother had ever drilled into her about angles and force and cover screaming through her mind in one continuous, urgent thread. 1 minute, she turned to run, and in that single, terrible instant, her foot caught hard against a buried piece of rebar jutting from the collapsed concrete, and she went down heavily, pain exploding through her ankle, the entire world tilting sideways as precious seconds simply vanished from her count. Because this, she thought with sudden clarity, was how it ended. Because after everything, after 18 years of grief and 4 months of impossible discovery, and a mother returned from the dead, just long enough to watch her only daughter run out of time, this was how it actually ended. Face down in loose gravel with a countdown she could no longer see but could somehow still feel, ticking steadily towards zero in her very bones. She forced herself back up, forced her battered body forward, dragging her injured ankle behind her, throwing herself away from the bunker with everything she still had left, diving hard behind a low earthen berm at the tree line just as the entire world went white. The blast rolled across the training field, like something almost biblical in scope, a concussive wave that flattened grass and shattered windows in buildings a quarter mile away, a sound so total and complete it seemed to erase every other sound that had ever existed before it. Then silence, then screaming, distant and scattered, the ceremony field finally, fully evacuated, families and graduates alike, scattered safely across the far side of the base, watching a column of smoke and debris rise slowly into a gray Gulf Coast sky above them. Kestrel was the first one over the berm, dropping hard to his knees beside a still, crumpled form half buried in loose earth and scattered debris. "Sloane," he said, his voice raw and cracking. "Sloane." She didn't answer. Blood matted through her hair, dark and terrible against the pale gray dust that coated absolutely everything around her. Her ankle sat at an angle that made Kestrel's stomach turn over completely. A piece of shrapnel had torn through her upper arm, and the concrete debris from the collapsed bunker had done exactly what she'd gambled it would do, absorbed enough of the blast force to spare the field entirely, and very nearly enough to spare her as well. Very nearly. "Medic!" Kestrel roared, the sound tearing out of him with a force that startled birds from the trees a full 100 yards away. "I need a medic here right now." Corinne reached the berm only seconds later, having run the entire distance from the ceremony field the moment the blast had rocked the ground beneath her own feet, and the sound that came out of her when she finally saw her daughter's still form was not a word at all. It was something older than language itself, something that belonged entirely to mothers who had already once believed they'd lost everything, and simply could not, would not, survive believing it a second devastating time. "Baby," Corinne sobbed, dropping hard to her knees in the debris, her hands hovering over Sloane's broken body, terrified to touch her, equally terrified not to. "Baby, please, 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 please." Sloane's eyelids fluttered, barely, a flicker so faint that Kestrel nearly missed it entirely in his own panic, but Corinne saw it immediately. Corinne, who had spent 18 years learning to read the smallest possible signs of survival in a world that had taught her, over and over, that nothing could ever fully be trusted, Saw it right away. She's alive, Corinne breathed, relief flooding her voice. Dale, she's alive. Where is that medic? 30 seconds out, Kestrel said, his own voice shaking now. 61 years old and entirely undone by the sight of a woman he'd trained beside for months, lying broken in the gravel exactly the way he'd once feared. 20 years earlier, her own mother might eventually be found. The medical team crested the rise 30 seconds later exactly as promised. A rapid response unit already mobilized from the ceremony's own emergency staging area, trained specifically for exactly this kind of catastrophic scenario, and never once expecting to actually use those hard-won skills on the very woman who had personally taught half of them how to keep a wounded soldier alive in the field. They found her there, bloodied, broken, barely breathing at all. Their instructor, their mentor, the woman who had, 4 months earlier, made an impossible shot at 400 yards and permanently changed the way an entire training class understood what genuine capability actually looked like in practice. Pulse is weak but present, the lead medic called out, hands already moving fast. Professional, entirely urgent. Multiple lacerations, probable fractured ankle, shrapnel wound to the upper left arm. We need to move her now. Casey Doyle arrived at the tree line, just as they lifted Sloane carefully onto a stretcher, his formal uniform torn and coated with debris from his own frantic scramble away from the blast zone, his face white with a terror that had absolutely nothing to do with his own personal safety. Is she? He started, unable to finish the question forming in his throat. She's alive, Kestrel said, gripping the young man's shoulder hard enough to anchor them both in place. She's alive, son. Because she made absolutely certain the rest of us would be too. Casey looked past him, toward the smoking ruin of the bunker, 200 yards from where families had been gathering only minutes earlier, and understood, in a single devastating instant, exactly what Sloane Whitmore had done for every single person on that field. She had carried the danger away from all of them, entirely alone, and had very nearly paid for it with everything she had left to give. The hospital waiting room in the hours that followed filled slowly with people who had no formal reason to be there, and every reason imaginable in the world. Ruth arrived first, Kestrel driving the entire way with his hands shaking visibly on the wheel, her face a mask of terror she hadn't worn since a folded flag had first been placed into her arms 18 years earlier. She found Corinne already sitting in the waiting room, and for a long moment neither woman spoke at all. Because there was nothing left worth saying that grief and hope hadn't already said between them 1,000 times over. Then Ruth crossed the room and pulled her daughter into an embrace 18 years overdue, and Corinne broke apart entirely in her mother's arms, sobbing in a way she hadn't once allowed herself since the night she'd staged her own death and driven away from everyone she loved to keep them all safe from what she'd uncovered. Casey arrived next, still wearing his torn formal uniform, unable to bring himself to change, unable to do anything except sit in a plastic waiting room chair and stare fixedly at the double doors that led back toward surgery. Holcomb arrived an hour later, moving slower than usual, 71 years old and carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent 30 full years chasing a truth that had very nearly cost him someone he'd only just begun, in these last few weeks, to consider genuine family. They sat together through the long afternoon and well into the evening, a strange and entirely improvised gathering of people, connected by nothing more than a woman fighting for her life behind a set of surgical doors, until finally, at 9:15 that night, a doctor emerged, exhaustion etched deep across her face, and asked which of them belonged to Sloane Whitmore. All of us, Ruth said, before anyone else in the room could answer first, her voice steady despite the tears streaming freely down her weathered face. All of us belong to her, every single one. The doctor's expression softened, just slightly, at the words. She's stable, the doctor said. It was close, closer than I'd honestly like to admit to any of you. The shrapnel wound required significant surgical repair, and her ankle will need considerable time along with physical therapy. But she's going to recover fully. The waiting room seemed to exhale as one single body, a collective release of breath held for hours that had felt to every person sitting in that room, like entire years passing by. "Can we see her?" Corinne asked, already rising from her chair. "She's not conscious yet," the doctor said gently. "But when she is, I imagine she'll want to see every single one of you gathered here tonight." Sloane woke slowly, the world arriving in fragmented pieces before it finally arrived whole and complete. White ceiling tiles above her, the steady, reassuring beep of a heart monitor somewhere nearby. Pain, distant and muffled beneath heavy medication, radiating from her arm and her ankle in slow, pulsing waves that came and went like tides. And a hand, warm and deeply familiar, wrapped tightly around her own. She turned her head slowly, every movement requiring real effort, and found her mother sitting beside the hospital bed, eyes red-rimmed and completely exhausted, watching her with an expression Sloane had spent 18 years without and had somehow, impossibly, never once stopped needing. "Mom," Sloane whispered, her voice cracked and barely recognizable even to herself. Corinne's face crumpled entirely at the sound. "I'm here," she said, gripping Sloane's hand even tighter. "I'm right here, baby. I'm not going anywhere ever again. Not for anything." "The graduation," Sloane said, panic rising even through the thick haze of medication clouding her mind. "The families, Casey. Did everyone is safe," Corinne said quickly, pressing her free hand gently against Sloane's forehead, the exact way mothers do to soothe children, whether they happen to be 6 years old or 26. "Because of you. Every single person on that field is safe today because of what you chose to do." Sloane closed her eyes, relief washing slowly through her entirely exhausted body. "Ashworth," she said. "Kestrel and the full security team found him trying to leave the base 20 minutes after the blast went off," Corinne said. "He's in federal custody now, held without bail, facing charges that will very likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his natural life." Sloane's eyes filled with tears, relief, and exhaustion, and 18 accumulated years of grief, finally, fully releasing all at once inside her chest. "I genuinely thought I wasn't going to make it," she whispered. "I thought that was truly the end for me." "I know," Corinne said, her own tears now falling freely down her face. "And I have never once in my entire life been more terrified than the exact moment I saw you lying broken in that field. But you did make it, Sloane. You made it through. And you did something today your father would have been endlessly proud to witness, and something I will spend the rest of my own life being deeply grateful I got the chance to see with my own eyes." The door opened quietly, and Ruth stepped carefully inside, her face lighting with a joy so profound it seemed to erase, for just one brief moment, every single one of the 18 hard years that had led everyone gathered here to this exact hospital room. "There's my girl," Ruth said, moving around to the other side of the bed, taking Sloane's uninjured hand gently in both of her own. 3 generations of women, together at last in a single hospital room, finally, completely whole again. Recovery took the better part of several months. Physical therapy that tested every single ounce of discipline Sloane had ever possessed in her entire life, teaching her ankle slowly to bear weight again, teaching her body to trust itself once more, the way it had before a countdown clock had very nearly stolen everything she loved away from her forever. But healing, she learned slowly and patiently over those long months, was never only physical in nature. Casey Doyle visited every single week without fail, sitting quietly beside her hospital bed, and later, once she'd been discharged, on her own living room couch, listening carefully as she finally told him the full and complete truth about his father, about the sacrifice Robert Doyle had knowingly made 20 years earlier, trying to expose the exact same corruption that had very nearly killed her too. "He'd be genuinely proud of you," Sloane told him, during one of those quiet weekly visits, watching something important shift and finally settle in the young man's tired face. "Not only because of what happened out there at graduation, because you kept asking honest questions when it clearly would have been so much easier for you not to. That's exactly the kind of man your own father was, from everything I've now learned about him." Casey's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since learning the painful truth about his father's death, something that genuinely resembled peace moved slowly across his young features. "I want to finish what he started," Casey said firmly. "Properly this time. On the official record for everyone to see." I want people to finally know exactly what he actually died trying to protect. Then we'll make absolutely certain they do, Sloane said. Together, the way it should have always been done. Colonel Grant Ashworth's court-martial began 4 full months later. A lengthy proceeding that stretched across several weeks. 20 years of carefully accumulated evidence finally laid bare in front of a military tribunal that had no remaining choice, but to reckon fully with the complete weight of everything he'd quietly built over 2 decades. Sloane testified at length. So did her mother, appearing publicly for the very first time in 18 years. Her staged death finally, officially corrected on federal record after nearly 2 decades of quiet erasure. So did Kestrel and Holcomb and Casey, each of them adding another crucial piece to a case that had ultimately taken 2 full decades and cost 2 separate lives to finally assemble in full. Ashworth was convicted on every single count brought against him. Conspiracy, attempted murder, 20 years of sustained theft from the very institution he had once solemnly sworn to faithfully serve. He would spend the remainder of his natural life in a federal military prison, stripped entirely of rank, stripped of the pension he had spent 2 decades protecting at the cost of so very much, stripped finally and completely of the power that had let him erase inconvenient truths for 20 straight years without ever once being made to properly answer for any of it. Justice, when it finally arrived slowly and deliberately, but it arrived complete in the end, exactly the way institutional justice is supposed to arrive. A full year to the day after the graduation ceremony that had very nearly ended her life, Sloane Whitmore stood once more at the 400-yard mark on Camp Alderwood's range, her ankle now fully healed, her arm bearing a scar she had long since stopped trying to hide beneath long sleeves. Beside her stood her mother, rifle steadied against her shoulder, for the first time in public in 18 long years, having finally accepted an offer to return as a civilian training consultant, teaching the next generation of instructors alongside the very daughter she had once believed we could best protect only by disappearing entirely. Behind them, Ruth sat comfortably in a folding chair someone had carried out from the mess hall, a shawl over her shoulders, despite the thick June heat, watching 3 full generations of resilience unfold together in front of her, with an expression that held every single year of waiting she had ever endured, finally, fully rewarded at last. Casey Doyle stood nearby, a junior instructor himself now, having chosen to remain at Camp Alderwood rather than accept a deployment assignment, determined instead to help train the next incoming class exactly the way Sloane had once helped save the last one from a fate none of them had ever seen coming. "Ready?" Corinne asked, glancing sideways at her daughter, with something like pride shining plainly in her eyes. Sloane smiled, settling into position beside her mother, the same stance, the same quiet discipline, 2 full generations of steady hands finally, completely united after everything they'd both survived to reach this single moment together. "Ready," Sloane said. They fired together, the twin cracks of their rifles echoing cleanly across the range in perfect, practiced unison, both shots striking dead center on targets standing 400 yards away. Ruth's laughter carried warmly across the field, unguarded and entirely joyful, a sound that hadn't filled that particular space in 18 long years of quiet waiting. And as the echo of gunfire slowly faded into the quiet Gulf Coast afternoon around them, Sloane finally understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, the true meaning behind the 4 simple words her mother had first taught her before she could even ride a bicycle, without training wheels. Breathe out. Then wait. Because waiting, she now understood fully, was never truly about doing nothing at all. It was about learning to trust that the moment which mattered most would eventually come, in its own time, and being fully ready, when it finally did arrive, to give absolutely everything you had left to protect the people you loved most in this world. She had waited 18 long years to finally understand her own mother completely. She would spend the rest of her entire life deeply grateful that understanding had finally, fully arrived in time to matter.